Hi, my name is Garrett Clement. I am an ROV technician for MC Wright & Associates, and I am here today to teach you how to properly decommission a ROV after a long field deployment. I most recently did a project with the Pacific Salmon Foundation, looking at herring spawn habitat in an effort to try and understand more about the salmon food chain and make sure that there is ample fish in the ocean for everybody, not just us. So we had this DTG Deeptrekker out for 3 weeks straight, running it pretty hard. So now it's time to decommission it properly and prep it for storage. One thing that's very important to understand about ROVs is they're complicated systems that are operating in a harsh environment. So they do require a fair bit of maintenance. The maintenance doesn't have to be super scientific. A lot of it comes down to just good habits around storage and cleaning. And we'll go through all of that today. I'm not here to say that this is the right or the wrong way to do it. It's just what's worked for me, and to try and share my experience with you on what it takes to take care of these machines. So let's get to it. So this right here is my field kit. This is my toolbox in the field, and it has everything I need to run the ROV, fix it, repair it, put it on charge. You notice I have 2 chargers, one for the ROV, one for the controller. I have some dielectric grease in there for when I need to re-grease ports or plugs. I have an air canister. I use this to basically, when I put the ROV on charge, I make sure to rinse it with fresh water. Then I blow the port dry with this duster and then add a little bit of the grease to make sure that it doesn't corrode. That has happened to me in the past, and it caused us to lose a day in the field, a charger and a port, and we actually had to send it in for repairs. So, important piece of equipment. I've got WD-40, a small can. I don't use this a ton, but it's good to have, especially if you're dealing with any sort of seized nuts or just parts that need to be just a little bit of lubricated or cleaned, but not used a whole lot. I've got some electrical contact cleaner. This is used to basically bring electronics back to life. This helps clean off corrosion and can get you out of a pinch. It's not the miracle cure, but it can definitely save your butt in a pinch. I've got a package of zip ties, very useful. Power bar. We use a Jackery to charge our ROV and our controller. That's usually good enough for, or a full charge on a Jackery is usually good enough for the whole day. But there's only one port, so we have this this power bar to basically be able to charge the controller and the ROV at the same time. Small set of pliers. This is just in case I need to get in and pull something out or undo a bolt or whatever. Small set of pliers is a good thing to have. These are quite important. These are diagonal cutting pliers. This, in my experience, is the best thing to use to cut zip ties. When working in the ROV, it's very important to have a precise tool for cutting zip ties, because often you're cutting very close to important cords and electronics. So you don't want to be using scissors or anything like that. You want the proper tool for the job. So make sure that you're comfortable with your cutting tool and that you're making sure that you're being careful when you're around wires or cutting electrical tape around wires, anything like that. All right. I got a spare hard drive. We always back up our data in 2 spots and in 2 locations. So after the data is off the ROV for the day, we take it off of the controller here and we put it onto a laptop, and then we also put it onto a spare hard drive, and they get put in different places just in case something goes overboard. Losing gear is one thing, losing data is another. If you spent thousands of dollars collecting data, it's important that you back it up and make sure that it's secure. A set of Allen keys. I really like these because they keep all the Allen keys compact. You use Allen keys for different parts on the ROV. Having something that's not going to get messy is important. And yeah, that's it. Then I have a spare parts kit. This has, I'll show you.
different screws and bolts that are on the ROV in case something gets lost or anything like that. I have some extra dielectric grease just in case, some smaller zip ties, super glue, very important thing to have, and also just other bits and bobs for spare parts, spare propellers, that sort of thing. All right, put that away. I also we'll have in here typically a couple of things of electrical tape, just because very useful stuff used in a lot of different applications. All right, one thing I do with these kits when I first come home is I put them on the table and I open them up and I let them air dry overnight, and then I'll come back and kind of clean them up in the morning. I'll also go through, because over the course of a survey, stuff tends to accumulate in these kits. Like you might notice that there's just a little bit of electrical tape there. You know, I take out a couple of rolls of tape so they can kind of accumulate, or, you know, you'll just go through and reorganize things, take out things like cut zip ties that tend to accumulate, and just spend some time reorganizing things as I let them dry. It's important not to just like pack up the cases and just leave them packed up and not letting them air dry, because any sort of water can help or can cause corrosion. You're not necessarily worried about like things like the bigger pieces corroding. What you're more worried about is the connectors, right? Anything that goes in the water or saltwater rated should get a thorough soak. This is our USBL. I actually left it in the water overnight and then I let it dry. But the weak points in these can often be things like this, where you've got our field USB cord. This helps basically connect the USBL to the controller. This is just a regular USB port. It can be prone to corrosion. You can get corrosion inside the prongs and that sort of thing. And if this cord goes, then you don't have a USBL and you don't have a ROV. So these are the things you're concerned about when you're kind of letting it air out, and just making sure you're taking care of your cords in your kit, because if you don't have your cords in your kit, you don't have a ROV. So little things like this matter, and it's kind of just adds to that attention to detail. One thing I would add about just these field kits in general is the fact that I make a concerted effort to make sure that these aren't cluttered. And the reason for that is I find if you get too much in your kit, and it's easy to at the start because you're just trying to be prepared for everything, what can happen is stuff tends to get piled in here and then jammed in here. And for things like chargers, it can be really bad because people just start shoving things in them, and then before you know it, you'll go down and you'll slam down and cinch down on a charging cord, and that could be it for the charger. So avoiding things like that is as simple as making sure you're going through and making sure there's enough space in here, and that you're doing things like tidying up your cords before they go in there, like elastic bands. I've also used neoprene cases for chargers. It also just declutters things, and trust me, you save the time getting organized in the field, and it's worth that, taking that extra 5 minutes to go through your kits and make sure that they're as clean and organized as possible. Very important. All right, so moving to more of the ROV, I actually let this ROV soak overnight. I have a bucket of water here. I just dumped it in there, and I let the ROV soak overnight. I took it out this morning, let it dry off before I start my decommission. And yeah, that'll be the next part of the video. But moving on to the ROV case, this also got a little bit of salt water in here. That's just natural. I tend to just give this a quick spritz. I'll turn it over, let it drain out, let it dry out completely before I put equipment back in the case. Tether is very important. You know, there's certain things that you do when taking care of a ROV after every single deployment, like giving the ROV a thorough rinse and rinsing off the tether as best you can. I don't do this after every day, but I do this after a long deployment. I'll unspool the tether into a tote, rinse it off, let the water drain out, and then let it dry overnight. And then so when I go to reel it back in, the tether stays dry. Now the tether is also a good chance to talk about wet connections and dry connections. The other end of the tether, this is it right here. This is the part of the tether that connects to the ROV. This is not a wet connect. It can take a little bit of weathering, but you'd want to make sure that this isn't soaked because it's not supposed to be. It can take a little bit of water, but it's not meant to be underwater for extended periods of time. So just keeping that in mind when you're going through and rinsing things is important. Which connections can be left in water, which connections can't be left in water. But you can even see on this, after spending all that time on the ocean, there is even a bit of corrosion starting to kind of form on the teeth of it itself. But, you know, I make a point to kind of spray this down every now and then with electrical contact cleaner. Not a lubed connection. Don't use that dielectric grease on here, but I definitely make sure to try and keep this as clean as possible. All right, so let's move on to decommissioning the actual ROV itself. A lot of this comes down to taking things apart and putting them back together again. So before you start this job, you want to make sure that your workspace is clean, that you're not in a rush to get it done, and that you have a few organizational tools, things like trays, Tupperwares, things that you can put screws, and that sort of thing in so that they don't get lost. I find that there's a lot of small parts with these ROVs, and it helps me to basically have a tray for each portion that I take apart so I know which parts go where. So yeah, let's get started. Disconnect my USB-L. That's what this is. I got my pins that hold the beacon on there. I'll put them in my tray. Take off the unit, and you can see there's already some water that's been left over there. It's been drying for hours, but water seeps in, and that's why we're here. If you don't take things apart and dry them off, a lot of times they'll just stay there wet and they'll corrode, and despite being left for hours to dry, they remain wet. And I've come here after a couple of days and still seen a lot of water just kind of hanging around. And that water can get in, corrode different aspects of it, and even just as simple as causing certain screws to seize, especially if they're not used a ton. That can cause a real problem if you need to get into a ROV. I most recently had a seized screws on the bottom here. We don't really take the bottom off very much, these kind of bottom ballast pins. So what happened is we left them for too long, salt got in and kind of fused the screws, and we almost completely stripped the screws trying to get them out of there. And it's a simple thing to say, but if you can't undo those screws, you can't adjust that ballast anymore, and that has just basically been welded to the ROV itself. I was fortunate enough to be able to get them undone and replaced, but you know, simple things like that can really get away from you, and it's not necessarily. Sometimes it's a little counterintuitive to think of. So making sure that you're kind of giving things a twist and a turn, undoing screws, cleaning out the ports, that sort of thing, very helpful. So yeah, it comes down to unscrewing things, and especially stuff that you don't think of, such as the ballast weights. You can see that quite a bit of water is kind of trapped around the ballast weights. Some parts will inevitably rust. That's just part of regular wear and tear. As you can see, some of these weights have rusted a bit. It's not the end of the world, but the point of this is the fact that there's water in here, and because there's water in here, there's water in other places. So the weights rusting might not be a big deal, but the screw mechanism that holds the weights in place is another story. You can already see there's a little bit of rust starting to accrue on the one screw. There's quite a bit of water in that mechanism, and if this seizes because it's rusted out, then you won't be able to use it anymore. So giving it a chance to just kind of undo things, let them dry out properly, make sure they're all rinsed with fresh water, helps. So I'll tend to unscrew things, let them dry, and then put them back together again. So I'll spend some time going over screws here. when operating anything in salt water has a really nasty habit of getting into things and causing them to not just corrode, but just the salt itself can cause screws to seize. So when you're kind of taking things apart at the end of a long deployment, what I sometimes will do is just get a little bit of WD, spray it into the holes, and then I'll take my screw and I'll put it in there. I'll make sure that I'll check to make sure that I'm not getting any stripping on the screws. Very important to replace these if you do see any significant stripping, because if it does seize on there, you're going to need a screw that's in as good a shape as possible. Let me take this off because you'll be able to see what I'm talking about better. There we go. All right. I'm trying to film and do this at the same time, so bear with me. All right, so if you notice when I screw into this, usually you'll have some stuff start to come out, and this just kind of helps work that cleaner into the actual screw slot. And yeah, you can already see some sediment and goop trying to get out from there. Yeah, it's coming. And that's just from, you know, grime and grease and all that stuff that kind of works its way in there. So this just gives it a chance to clean out that that thread and make sure that you can get that screw in and out of there easily and it doesn't seize. So you can see, yeah. All right, so just finished my first cleaning of those 4 different screw holes, and you can already see that there was quite a bit of dirt and grime that kind of accumulated over the course of the job. So I'll actually go ahead and repeat that 2 to 3 times just to get as much of that dirt out of there as possible, to make sure that those screws are going in and out of there as easily as possible. All right, next thing. Moving on to the sensor harness. We have, you see 4 screws right here. I'll be taking those out and cleaning those as well. And we also are going to unplug all of the ports, give them a quick visual inspection, and yeah, go from there. All right, so moving on, I've got a few of my ports kind of unhooked. You can go in and see that there's a bit of water that kind of sneaks in through the O-rings. Still very well greased. Down here, same kind of thing. See a little bit of corrosion there on that port. We actually had that goes to our vertical thruster right here. We actually had this stop working in the field. I can do a little bit of diagnosis at another point or in another video on how to diagnose different problems on the ROV. But you know, the short and skinny of it is the vertical thruster stopped working in the field, popped open the port, and saw a bit of corrosion in there. Yeah, so there's a bit of a fault in that connection. So we'll try to do our best to kind of clean that off. Some of the grease is looking a bit old, so we'll clean that out as well. Things like this also tend to get forgotten about. This is an unused port. It's for a grabber arm that isn't a part of our assembly. But making sure you're also kind of going in and unscrewing the stuff that you don't use a ton, because it tends to get forgotten about, and water can still get in there. You see there's a bit of water in there as well. So we're going to clean that out, dry that out, and probably re-grease it. Another thing to tell you about is this is our main tether connection. It's very sturdy. Just by design, it's the most important cord going into the ROV. But you'll notice it's a bit hard to get into and hard to unscrew. And a lot of people can take the big tools to their equipment and ruin it. For instance, this screw, that right there, is made of plastic. So if you're a little rough on it, you're going to strip that screw real quick and you're going to wear your equipment prematurely. It can get really tough to unscrew, and often people tend to get frustrated and just take the big tools to it, which can cause damage. So it's just one of the things is wrapping your head around is to try and look at these jobs and find different ways and try different things and see what works for you. Everyone's got, just as simple as everyone has different sized hands. So what works for one person is not necessarily going to work for another. But finding ways to kind of get in there and unscrew it it can be part of the trick. So let's see if I can get this thing off. All right, so now I'm just going to clean out the port. I'll be using a small flathead screwdriver to do this, and a lot of care and patience. So let's see if I can get in there. It's a bit tricky with the camera in the way, but we'll give our best. Give kind of the outside a quick spritz there. Take my flathead screwdriver, and this is where being gentle and going slow is critical. I'm going to just wrap my piece of paper towel around, and then ever so gently I'm going to push it in with the screwdriver around the ports, being very conscious of those prongs because they are delicate. And I'm just going to lightly kind of do my best to kind of push it back and forth and pick up as much of that stuff as I can, and then kind of repeat the process around. Just nice and gentle, not using any sort of force, not pushing, not trying to get too fancy being in between the prongs there, because the end goal is just to get out what you can. Sometimes you're not going to get all of it. All right. Let's see. Yeah, you can see a bit of, I see that on the camera, a bit of blue there. That's evidence of some corroded ports. So the issue with our vertical thruster is most likely to do with our ports. We might need to swap that out. But these are good things to know after a field deployment and not before a field deployment, because a lot of times you can catch these issues before you send the gear out there again, and make sure that they get addressed well in advance, so it saves you time in the field. All right, let's move on to thrusters. Generally, anything that's moving in the ocean, you need to be wary of. It's a kind of a weak spot for water to get in and start gumming up, not just water, but also dirt and grime, and it can gum up the moving parts, and you'll start to see a lot of efficiency loss. So it's important to take these apart, clean them out, make sure that there's no corrosion, inspect them, and put them back together again. So let's do that. So I'm just going to use my little needle nose pliers here, grab onto my bolt. You can get the proper bolt. Pretty recommended that you do, but I've found that I can also, in a pinch, get these off. Another thing when you're dealing with bolts on equipment, make sure you don't over tighten. Finger tight is good with a lot of metal on metal connections. Just finger tight and then give it a light turn after the fact. Usually does the job. You want to avoid over tightening because it will strip your screws, and once your screws are stripped, that becomes a whole other bigger issue. When I'm doing this too, these are cheap nuts that can be bought at any Home Depot. If the nut is looking stripped and needs to be replaced, I'll go ahead and do that. Obviously, I'm not going to do it if it's not required. But taking a look at them, does it look mangled? Does it look like you could get in there and get it off is kind of your main questions. And you can kind of already see there's a bit of corrosion in there. Once I get this off. All right. Okay. You can see a little bit of rust in there. We'll clean that out. You can see a little bit of what looks to be eelgrass or rope or some sort of algae that's kind of gotten into the mechanism there. We'll have to clean that out. The next step is I'll take off this thruster and take a look. All right, so I've taken off the thruster. As you can see, there is a fair bit of water that's kind of leached its way in there. So I'll dry that off, clean things out. You can see even now some more debris that's been kind of caught in the thruster. I'll take that off and clean that as best I can. One note is I won't exactly try and take apart everything. If it's not coming apart easily, I'd leave it alone. If you're really concerned about it, contact the customer service of your ROV provider. big shout out to Deeptrekker here. They've got an awesome customer service department. So if you get on the phone with one of their technicians, they'll tell you what to do. They'll provide you with procedures and that sort of thing to make sure that you can maintain your ROV properly and that you're not going to inadvertently break things. When first starting out, I didn't really know what I was doing, and they were kind enough to help me out. So always be kind to your customer service ROV provider, and yeah, they can work some wonders for you. So yeah, don't be afraid to reach out. Another pro tip: take pictures of things. Knowing what the things are, I'm kind of speeding through this a little bit, just in the interest of keeping things a little bit concise. But often, especially if I'm working on a part of the ROV that I haven't worked on, I'll make sure to take lots of pictures of what things look like before I start taking things apart, because it's easy to get kind of a little bit excited and in the repair and a little bit wrapped up, and to kind of go in and try and fix the issue, and then get to the part where you need to put things back together and realize that you don't exactly know how things were. So it's important to take pictures of pictures as you go through the repair. It can be an absolute lifesaver. All right. Yeah, you can see a fair bit of water got into this one as well. So we will dry that off, re-grease the O-rings, being mindful. Always keep an eye out for where O-rings are. Get to know your ROV, where your O-rings are, which ones need to be replaced. Always check your O-rings. If things are looking worn out, replace them. If you don't know how to replace an O-ring, contact your ROV provider. They will help you out. But it's easy to kind of, again, take these things apart, not see the O-ring. O-ring falls out, causes the road to flood, and you've had a bad day in the field. So keep an eye out for your O-rings. Make sure they are cleaned and maintained properly. All right, just looking at an O-ring inspection here, you can kind of see, if you can see that, there's a bit of salt crystals built up on there. So yeah, and there's a bit of salt and grime and goo that's kind of built up on the inside as well. So plan is to just clean these off and re-grease them. All right, so now that we're done taking things apart and cleaning them, it's time to put everything back together. The biggest advice I can give when performing maintenance or repairs is make sure that you give yourself enough time. You don't want to be in a rush when doing these operations. You want to be very methodical. You want to be taking the time to look at each part as you're taking it apart and as you're putting it back together. This will not only ensure that you don't make mistakes, but it'll also help you understand your machine. It's very important to kind of get to know things, how they're put together, how they're taken apart, how things look when they're right, how they look when they're wrong. And when it comes to diagnosing things, the more you know about your unit, the quicker you're going to be able to think your way through those issues. So make sure you give yourself plenty of time. And with that being said, let's get this ROV ready for storage. Right, so now it's time to get the tether back on the reel. To do this, I have a towel and I have my bucket. When I was putting the tether into the bucket, I was just simply leafing it into the tote. Now this next part's really important. When it comes to putting it back on the tether, I'm going to flip this upside down and then I'm going to reel it back in. So there's a bit of water still in there, so bear with me. I'm not going to move this tether. Everything's kind of piled on top of each other. So if I go and I move this tether around, the danger is that I'm going to put a knot in it. So the idea is you leaf it directly into the tether, you spray it down, you rinse it, and then when it comes to putting it back on the reel, you flip it over, and then you don't touch it, and you just reel it back in. And if you do that, then you should go back onto the reel nice and easy. If you move the tether around, what's going to happen is you're going to put a knot in the tether, and it's going to become a huge headache really quickly. It can be, you know, a 2-hour thing to fix a knotted tether or a tangled tether. So making sure you just leave it directly into the tote, flip it over, don't touch it, reel it right back in. All right, next start is, as you might notice, I did leave this dry overnight, but it is still a bit damp here and there. That's why I have this towel that I'm basically going to run the tether through as it comes in, just to dry it off even more. Yeah. All right. The tension, I just want to make sure I'm maintaining nice tension. I don't know if you can see this, but I was kind of distracted. And I let a little bit of a loop form. So I don't know if you can see that, but that's not what you want. So I'm going to undo that and redo it nice and tight. You just kind of, when putting the tether back on the reel, you kind of want to be nice and even about going back and forth. You don't want to overload one side or the other. Rarely will you get it on there perfect unless you have like an automated feeder. But what you want to avoid is big, basically canyons, and then having big kind of V's. So because if that happens, what can happen is when you keep putting more and more loops on and a piece of tether gets caught in that V, as you put more and more on, it basically gets pinched and can damage the tether just from the pressure that it's getting from either side. Right, I got the ROV back together. This is another critical step is just a wet test. The ROV itself does have a humidity sensor. So I have this on. I've had this on for like the last 5 minutes. However, what also I will do is I'll get a light and and I'll look at the part of the ROV that I was working on. So in this instance, I went in and cleaned the thrusters. So I'll actually get a light and I'll kind of just peek in and just spend some time watching where that thruster is to see if there's any sort of water coming in or leaking in. You know, just coming in on checking on it, leaving it for a number of space or a number of time, or amount of time, I should say. You also can sit here and look for bubbles. Bubbles, you're looking for a steady stream of bubbles. If you see a couple of bubbles like pop up here and there, it's not necessarily a leak. Most of the time it's just a bubble that's kind of trapped somewhere in the body, and it's just from when you first dip it in. But if you see a steady stream coming in from any sort of crease or O-ring, could be a sign of a leak. But yeah, just it's important that anytime you open up the ROV that you do a wet test, just to make sure that you don't have any water egressing into the main body of the ROV itself before you take it out into the field. If it happens in your shop, then there's nothing really to fix, and you can just go redo your work. But if it happens in the field, you could be talking about losing your ROV. So it's worth the extra 5-10 minutes to sit here and do a wet test. Yeah, and just make sure you're just kind of monitoring the ROV and looking at the seams and making sure there's no problems. All right, so we're finished our decommission. We've done our wet test. Everything seems to be okay. I'll just let this ROV completely dry off before I store it away, but I hope you learned something. Again, this is Garrett Clement from MC Wright & Associates, ROV technician. I'll see you next time.